I'm Tori.
I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elena.
And this is APUSH Review Chapters 5 through 8.
Taxation.
Leading up to the Revolution, the British began imposing more and more taxes on the colonies, and some important ones were the Sugar Act, which included writs of assistance, which were open-ended search warrants to search for smuggled goods. Some more were the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, which was taxes on glass, tea, lead, and paint, the Tea Act, the Intolerable Acts, the Quebec Act, and the colonists would boycott goods, and they were actually willing to pay for more expensive goods if it meant that they wouldn't have to pay taxes to Britain. And the colonists believed that the British had no right to tax them because they weren't represented in Congress.
The First Continental Congress.
The First Continental Congress was formed as a response to the Intolerable Act. 12 leaders from various colonies met to discuss colonial resistance to the Acts of Parliament. It ended in an almost complete shutdown of trade with Britain and the West Indies, and this encouraged domestic manufacturing in the colonies.
The Second Continental Congress.
The outbreak of the war led to the formation of the Second Continental Congress, which authorized the raising of an army led by George Washington. The Declaration of Independence.
The United States Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson and was adopted by the Second Continental Congress meeting at the Pennsylvania State House on July 4, 1776. It announced that the 13 American colonies would regard themselves as 13 independent, sovereign states, no longer under British rule. It drew on ideas from John Locke, like natural rights. It lists our unalienable rights, which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In it, it also claims that the authority of the government rests in the people, and that all men were created equal. The Revolutionary War?
Britain declared the colonies a state of rebellion and sent thousands of troops while closing all of the colonial ports. And the Olive Branch Petition was an attempt to make peace, but King George III rejected it. And African Americans were a big part of the war effort, and at first Washington refused to accept black recruits, but this changed after Lord Dunmore's proclamation that Britain would give slaves their freedom for fighting against the colonies, and Rhode Island eventually did the same as Lord Dunmore. Many African Americans did end up fighting, but only in segregated groups. Escaped slaves also served in the Royal Army as spies. The right to vote?
By the 1790s, a large majority of adult white males could meet voting requirements, with the exceptions of the citizens of Virginia, Maryland, and New York. During this time, the idea of freedom and the right to vote became interchangeable. Religious toleration.
So joining forces with the French during the Revolution weakened the anti-Catholic sentiments, and many people thought that religion was necessary in some type, but they didn't want it to be imposed in government. And during this time, 7 state constitutions mentioned the free practice of religion, but many states still limited religious freedoms.
Women?
The Daughters of Liberty were women who helped in the fight for independence and did things like making homespun goods for people to buy instead of taxed goods, and they raised funds to assist soldiers and participated in political discussions of independence. And although many women did experience some autonomy during this time, they also experienced limitations such as coverture, which was how the husband held legal authority over his wife. And because women lacked the opportunity for complete autonomy, they didn't meet the qualifications for political participation. An important concept for women during this time was Republican motherhood, which is basically that the woman's place was raising their children to be good citizens.
Articles of Confederation.
The Articles of Confederation basically served as the first constitution of the United States, but it was more of a firm league of friendship and required a unanimous vote to amend. And the only powers given to the federal government were the power to declare war, the power to conduct foreign affairs, and to make treaties.
Land ordinances.
Some important land ordinances include the Land Ordinance of 1784, which established stages of self-government for the West, and the region would be divided into districts initially governed by Congress and eventually admitted to the Union as states. The Ordinance of 1785 regulated land sales in the region north of the Ohio River, and the land was also put aside for public education.
The weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation.
To finance the Revolutionary War, Congress borrowed large sums of money by selling interest-bearing bonds and paying soldiers and suppliers in notes, which would be redeemed in the future. However, they lacked a true way to finance the war. Indebted farmers, with loss of land and failure to meet tax or mortgage payments, pressed the government for relief and were often put in debtor's prison. This turned into Shays' Rebellion. Crowds of debt-ridden farmers closed courts in western Massachusetts to prevent seizure of their land for failure of paying taxes. These people called themselves the Regulars. Daniel Shays was the leader of the rebellion, as he was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. The governor dispatched troops and arrested many of the protesters. The purpose of this rebellion was to persuade people that the national government must be strengthened so it can develop uniform economic policies and protect property rights. Shays' Rebellion challenged the fact that the government could not form and deploy a military or regulate the economy as a whole.
Slavery.
In the United States during this time, slavery heavily divided the delegates. The words slave and slavery did not appear in the Constitution. The South Carolinian delegates proved very influential in preserving slavery within the Constitution. The Constitution prevented Congress from prohibiting slave trade until 1808. I'm a Federalist.
And I'm an anti-federalist.
Me, I favor the Constitution, and I think the Articles of Confederation are weak, and I believe in a strong central government. Me and my pals, Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay, wrote the Federalist Papers.
I'm an anti-federalist and I want a Bill of Rights. I think that the Constitution is going to be an oppressive government, and me and my pals, we're mostly rural farmers.
The Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights were the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. They were ratified in 1791 and guaranteed rights such as the freedom of speech, assembly, and worship.
I'm Hamilton, and I believe that the national government should absorb state debts. We should have a national debt. The Bank of the United States should be a thing. We should tax whiskey and impose tariffs.
Hamilton, I don't think that should happen, but I think we can come to an agreement. I'm Jefferson, by the way. And I think if we put the Capitol in Washington, D.C., I could agree on it.
Well, all right. I'm Hamilton, and I'm a Federalist.
Jefferson, and I like a small-scale government. I'm a strict constructionist of the Constitution.
And I think the Constitution is open for interpretation.
I favor a hands-off economic approach.
And I think the government should regulate our economics. I want a national bank.
I don't think we should have one because it's not strictly in the Constitution.
I think we should have tariffs because they help build our manufacturing sectors.
I think that taxes should only be used to raise money for the government.
I think the government should absorb the debt of the states.
I don't think the government should because I believe that since a lot of states paid off their debts after the Revolutionary War, it wouldn't be fair.
I think we should be allies with the British.
I think we should be allies with the French.
The Electoral College unanimously chose George Washington to be the first president of the United States. Washington didn't seek out the presidency, but as the most popular figure in the colonies, he accepted the role out of a sense of obligation.
Slavery and politics.
The Three-Fifths Compromise allowed states to count slaves toward the population, and this gave a disproportionate amount of electoral votes to southern states. The first Congress received petitions calling for emancipation, which really kick-started the slavery debate. And in 1793, Congress adopted a law to actually enforce the Constitution's fugitive slave law. The Haitian Rebellion established Haiti as an independent nation in 1804. Gabriel's Rebellion, which took place in Virginia in 1800, was an attempt to use the language of liberty of the American Revolution to argue for the freedom of slaves. And this actually had the adverse effects of making Virginia's slave laws more strict.
Adams' presidency.
So in the election of 1796, Adam and Jefferson were running against each other. Now Adam won in the end, however, it was a policy at the time that the runner-up would then become the vice president. This caused a lot of tension in the White House due to Adams and Jefferson's opposing political ideologies. Also during this time, the quasi-war was happening. America was trying to keep good relationships with England and France. However, the two countries were in war. Because of this war, France disrupted our trading, which really didn't make us happy. John Adams also passed something called the Alien and Sedition Acts. During this time, John Adams was getting a lot of flack for his presidency. In response to this, he decided to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts, a crime to criticize the government. This didn't really work out. In fact, it sort of backfired because this sparked more controversy. Another thing why it didn't work was the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that created opposing laws that basically contradicted and changed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it completely legal to criticize the government.
Jefferson's presidency.
The 1800 election was Jefferson versus Aaron Burr. They received equal amounts of electoral votes, and the House of Representatives had to vote. It was the first U.S. transfer of power, from Federalists to Democratic Republicans. There was no violence, and it set into place the tradition of a peaceful transfer of power. One of Jefferson's goals when taking office was to erase all of the Federalist policies that Adams had put into place before him. Before Adams left office, he made a number of midnight appointments, filling as many government positions with Federalists as possible. Although Jefferson pushes for a small, weak central government, he uses his powers as president to the fullest while in office. The landmark case, Marbury versus Madison, happened in 1803, and the case decided and allowed for judicial review, so the Supreme Court had the power to rule things constitutional or unconstitutional. Jefferson sent James Monroe to France to try and buy New Orleans from the French. Napoleon was in the midst of war with Europe, and the Haitian Revolution was occurring, which convinced the French to scale down their involvement in the New World. The French offered to sell Monroe the whole Louisiana territory for $15 million. This showcases Jefferson going against his beliefs and using his power as president to the fullest because it did not state in the Constitution that a president could do this.
The War of 1812.
In 1805, Britain and France were in a stalemate in their war. Each side began blockading each other's trade routes. Since the United States was dependent on both France and England, it greatly hurt the economy. The British began stopping and impressing American sailors. This meant that they declared with little to no proof that those sailors had deserted from the British Navy and that they forced them back into it. Jefferson responded with a boycott, trying to bide his time while increasing military and naval presence in the region. Jefferson lobbied for the Embargo Act of 1807, which shut down American imports and exports. This greatly hurt the American economy, but it also promoted American manufacturing. After observing the detrimental effects on the economy from the Embargo Act, Jefferson passed the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809, which reopened trade with most nations, but still officially banned trade with France and Britain. James Madison passed the Macon's Bill No. 2, which reopened trade with both France and Britain. Madison announced that if either countries harassed American shipment, he would stop trade with that country. Britain was angry about the embargo and stepped up impressment of U.S. ships. This helped build war sentiments in the United States. The Warhawks were anxious to confront Britain and saw it as an opportunity to gain new territories. Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun were two very prominent figures that were Warhawks. Madison asked Congress to declare war in 1812 after holding out for as long as he could. Native Americans aligned themselves with the British. Tecumseh unified tribes in an effort to stop American expansion. The British captured Washington, D.C. during the war and set the White House on fire. Andrew Jackson gained his popularity from the War of 1812. He fought in the Battle of New Orleans, which was the only clear victory of the war. The war ended with the Treaty of Ghent. The aftermath of the war was that it destroyed the Federalist Party, and that the war represents the end of Native Americans' ability to stop American expansion. In addition, the war spurred American manufacturing.
The Federalist Party ended after the War of 1812 at the Hartford Convention. A lot of people distrusted the Federalist Party because of their elite status in society and the things they were standing for. At the convention, they kind of complained a lot about the regulations in the economy. For the War of 1812, they were against the war, and this didn't sit well with most Americans. The most radical thing that they talked about was many of the New England states wanted to secede if their demands weren't met. So everybody thought this was totally crazy, and that kind of led to their demise.
Bye.